guys, so let's talk about comping. Now, to comp means to accompany or to complement a soloist. So while the soloist is sort of improvising away at the front of the stage, you're at the back of the stage with the rhythm section, kind of keeping it all going, keeping it all together. Now, while you're comping, you really have two objectives. The first one is to complement the soloist both rhythmically and harmonically, and I'm going to go through the rules of each in this video. And the second objective is to stay out of the soloist's way. And to do this, you really need to listen to the soloist. So when you're comping, you're not really doing your own thing. What you're doing really depends on what the soloist is doing. And again, I'll go through a few rules of how you can stay out of the soloist's way in this video. Now, there are a number of sort of comping styles you can employ when comping, and very broadly they are playing some kind of bass line with your left hand and rootless chords in your right hand, so something like that, and that's a good one to employ when you don't have a bass player so that you're covering off on the bass part. Another style is to use sort of two-handed chord voicing, so and that's good to employ when you do have a bass player who's taking care of the bass and you're kind of in this middle register here. And the third style is playing rootless chords in your left hand and kind of little fills or playing a harmony in your right hand. So something like that. And all the rules and ideas that I cover in this video are applicable to all the different styles of comping. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, your primary objective when you're comping is to complement the soloist both rhythmically and harmonically. Now, the rules and ideas around rhythm when you're comping are really quite simple, and your primary goal here is to have variety, to sort of keep it interesting and to not just repeat the same thing over and over, to have a nice varied rhythm. But the first thing I should mention is something called vamping. Now, vamping is just playing the same pattern over and over again. It's like playing a riff. And a really famous one is from the song Take 5. So the left hand just plays the same thing again and again. And that's called a vamp. Now, comping is different because you don't want to be playing the same thing over and over again. You want to be creating a bit of variety in your rhythm. Now, when comping, the first thing you can do is either play with or between the melody. Now, let's take the song Autumn Leaves as an example. So this is Autumn Leaves with me comping with the melody. Right, so every time I played a melody note, I also played a chord. So I was comping with the melody. I was playing chords to the same rhythm as the melody. And the opposite of that is comping between the melody. So only playing chords when the melody is not playing, either because there's a rest or a long note. So something like this. You also want to play a combination of short notes and long notes in order to get, like I said before, a wide variety of rhythms. So for example, something like this. Right, so that was a combination of long and short notes, and I was playing a combination of on and off the beat. Now, a few other things to note. Firstly, silence is okay. Don't be afraid of silence. It's perfectly fine to just not play chords for a little while. Now, the other thing to note is that you really need to listen to the soloist and, in a sense, do the opposite of what he or she is doing. For example, if the soloist is playing a really busy and a really fast and a really complicated solo, then you want to keep your comping pretty sparse and pretty simple. Just Whereas if the solo is pretty simple and the soloist is inserting a lot of pauses and a lot of rests, then your comping can be a little bit more busy. Alright, now let's deal with the rules around harmony. Now obviously you can extend and alter and substitute chords when you're comping, but you don't want to overdo it at first. For example, if you're playing with someone new who you haven't played with before, then you want to keep it relatively simple until you pick up his sort of soloing style. Or if you're playing a brand new song which you've never played before, obviously you want to keep it a little bit simple at first. And if you're comping for a vocalist, you generally want to keep the harmony a little bit simpler because it's much harder to hit a note if you're singing, because obviously you need to tune your vocal cords compared to just like hitting a key on the piano or on the guitar or on a saxophone or whatever. Now, when you're comping, it's also fine to throw in little ornamentals like passing notes or grace notes or little runs, or put in a walking bass line, or put in fills over rests or long notes. But you want to keep them relatively safe and relatively simple because, again, you're not the one who's soloing here, you're complementing the soloist, so you don't want to sort of take over. But it's perfectly fine to do things like this. Right, so adding little passing notes or little runs, as long as they're simple and quick and short and don't get in the way of the soloist, that's perfectly fine. But by far the most important thing that you have to know off the top of your head when you're comping is different chord voicings. Knowing and applying different chord voicings will either make or break your comp. Now, I've got a whole separate series of videos on widely used jazz chord voicings, so I'm not going to go over that here. Instead, in this video, I'm going to give you a few rules as to how you can combine different chord voicings in a comping context in order to have your comp sound professional and smooth. Now, the first comping voicing rule is that you have to play in the appropriate register. Now, generally that means sort of the middle register here. But again, this is where you have to listen to the soloist and complement the soloist. If the soloist starts playing really low down here, then you should comp sort of higher up to get out of his way, because otherwise it'll sound really muddy if everyone is down the bottom. Similarly, if the soloist starts playing really high up, then you should comp a bit lower to sort of counteract and balance his higher register soloing, especially if you don't have a bass player. If you have a bass player taking care of this, you can sort of stick to the middle. Now, the second voicing rule is that you should generally use intervals of fourths or greater. This gives you an open chord voicing which leaves more space for the soloist. And it also makes the chord you're playing a little bit more ambiguous. For example, a quartal voicing can be a number of different chords. And this allows the soloist to do a lot more with that particular chord voicing. It sort of opens up a realm of opportunity and options to him. Now, the third voicing rule is just because the bass player is playing a root doesn't mean that you can't play a root. Don't unnecessarily avoid the root. If your voicing has a root down the bottom, that's fine. It's not going to ruin anything. So don't be afraid to play the root. The fourth voicing rule is something I've called the law of conservation of energy. When you're playing chords, you don't want to jump around too much. You want to minimize the movement between chords. You want to change as few notes as possible moving from one chord to the next, within reason of course, and those notes that do change, you want to change as small an interval as possible. So for example, going from a so what voicing D minor 7 down to a G7, you can just move one note down one semitone, so move the C down to a B. And if you do that, minimizing movement between chords, keeping as many notes the same as you can, and minimize the interval that the notes that do change have to move, you're going to have really smooth chord transitions and a really smooth sounding comp. Now, the other thing that's used a lot in comping is something called parallelism or parallel movements. And essentially all that means is that wherever you can, you want to use chromatic approach chords and side slipping. Now, a chromatic approach chord is just a passing chord one semitone away from the chord you're going to. So for example, if you're going from a G7 to a C major 7, you can throw in a chromatic approach chord before the C major 7, one semitone away. So for example, playing a C sharp major 7. So you could go G7, approach chord, down to the C major 7. And side slipping is essentially just that. It's when you're on a specific chord for a period of time, it's just slipping one semitone down and then back up, or one semitone up and then back down. And that's the type of thing I was using earlier in this video, doing stuff like this. Right, so keeping the same chord voicing, just slipping up and down one semitone. And the final voicing rule that you should employ when you're comping is something called soprano voice leading. Now, all this means is essentially creating a counter melody with the top note of your chord voicings. And really what that means is that when you're playing chords, the top note of the voicing you've chosen shouldn't be jumping around too much. You should try pick voicings where the top note either stays the same or moves up and down in steps. So soprano voice leading is really, really important when you're comping, and you really need to pay attention to it whenever you're comping for a soloist or whoever. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that your second objective is to stay out of the soloist's way. Now, I've already mentioned all of these, but I thought it might be worth reiterating it. Essentially, the way you do this is by playing in a different register to the soloist, using voicings with intervals of fourths or wider, using short staccato notes with pauses. Again, don't be afraid of silence. And by not using overly complex alterations or harmonies or substitutions at first. And again, what you really must do when you're comping is to listen to the soloist and to complement the soloist by doing these things, by staying out of his way. Now, to show you an example of how this is done in practice and how you can put all of these things together, let's take the song G Baby Ain't I Good to You. Now, I'm just going to take the first two A sections. Now, if you wanted to, you could comp over this song as follows. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so that was just a quick little comp over the first two A sections of G Baby Ain't I Good to You. Now, up here in the picture-in-picture, I've written out the original chord, the chord I played, the voicing I used, and the soprano note of each chord. Now, you can go back and listen to that comp, but notice that there was generally not much jumping around. There was minimum movement between chords. For example, from the C7 to the A flat 7, I did that. And then to get to the G7, I went there. Right, so there's not much jumping around. It's all quite close to each other. Next, in bar 6, the B flat 7, I inserted a little passing note, so it went F minor 7 to B flat 7, and I went. Right, so little passing notes are perfectly fine, little ornamentals. And then in bar 8, over the G7, I did this. Right, so that's quite a busy comp, and I did that because I know that there's actually no melody playing in bar 8. And generally, when a soloist is improvising, they tend to finish off their phrase towards the end of a section and sort of subside there or stop their solo, take a breath in preparation for the next section and their next phrase. And so generally the solo sort of quietens down towards the end of a section, which means that my comping can get a little bit more busy to sort of compensate for the slowdown in the solo. Then in the next section, I used a whole bunch of parallelism. I played a C sharp diminished, and then I just went down in semitones. Right, so again, there's that parallel movement that sounds really good. And then in the second last bar, over the E flat 6, I did something like this. So again, a little bit of side slipping there. And now let's look at the soprano, or the top note of every single chord voicing that I played. Now, it went like this. Right, so that in and of itself is a little bit of an improvisation. It could very well be the melody of this song. It sounded very melodic, it sounded very smooth. I wasn't jumping around. Right, by and large, the melody moves up and down in steps, whether semitone or a tone. And this counter melody, the top note of each chord, really makes the whole thing stick together quite well and makes the transition from one chord to the next sound really smooth and really professional. Right, so hopefully you see that I've tried to use all the rules that I covered earlier in this video in this little comp. And hopefully you agree that it sounds quite smooth and quite nice. But again, like I said before, in order to be able to do this, you really need to have your head around all the different chord voicings that you can use. Otherwise, that's it for me. Thanks for watching this. As always, feel free to leave any questions or comments about comping in this video. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.